All right. We are live, and I'm just going to share this with my YouTube Discord server. And I'm going to get into talking about John Spong, or at least listen about him. Let's see, announcements. Going live now. So hopefully I can go down to 266. It's okay to plateau for a bit. Oh! I was just messaging you, Devin. Hi. Okay, so let us... if you've never heard of John Spong, this is what he looks like. And he died at the age of 90 in 2022 or something like that. So there, I just found a CBC radio piece about John Spong, or Jack as he was like to be called. He died in 2021. Yeah. So this guy influenced, let me change it to this view. This guy influenced my viewpoint of Christianity. He was one of the people I listened to back in university in like 2010-ish, 2009, 10, 11, something like that. It's funny because back then I would actually listen to the likes of Christopher Hitchens, who was a devout atheist. He would debate with religious folks and try to crush them and list all the reasons why organized religion is bad and why we should get rid of it in our world. And he actually made a lot of sense. Christopher Hitchens makes a lot of good points, and it's hard to disagree with all the points he makes. But at the same time, I felt like he was missing something that he was missing something that I wish he could be tapping into. And then I found this guy, John Shelby Spong. As you can see here, his name is spelled like that, John Shelby Spong. This old man. I saw this old man on YouTube alongside Christopher Hitchens in the suggested... Well, I guess I was looking up, probably searching for stuff. And so I started watching what he had to say. This former bishop who questioned everything about Christianity, grew up as a fundamentalist Christian, yet started questioning everything. And with John Shelby Spong, I found he really did what Christopher Hitchens didn't, in that he points out the same or similar things that Christopher Hitchens does about what is not good about organized religion and the downsides of all that, and all the dogma and all the teachings that are, yeah. So he points out all the bad stuff, just like Christopher Hitchens. But then he goes beyond that, and there's something he taps into beyond just what the atheist sees of this materialist point of view, this materialist worldview. He goes beyond that, and I had a feeling he was onto something more, something that Christopher Hitchens did not see. This guy was seeing, John Shelby Spong. And so I resonated with him more than with Christopher Hitchens, even though I was fascinated by what Christopher Hitchens had to say. By the way, someone else said this as well. Sam Harris said this as well, but I really do wish Christopher Hitchens lived a much longer life. I think he died early in his 60s when I was, several years back. He's a very interesting commentator and it would have been really fascinating to see what Christopher Hitchens had to say in the current state of the world, politics or otherwise, not even politics, but maybe just maybe on social media and everything else. It would have been fascinating to hear his commentary on all those things. He was a very articulate writer and speaker. So sad that Christopher Hitchens is gone, even if he wasn't the person I most resonated with the topic of discussing religious beliefs and the good and bad of religion, all that. Yeah, so enough about Christopher Hitchens. Now let's focus on John Shelby Spong. I haven't listened to this. I only listened to a few minutes of this on CBC News Tapestry. It's a radio program, remembering John Shelby Spong. So let's listen to this together.
A couple of weeks ago on Tapestry, we took a few minutes to remember John Shelby Spong, a retired bishop who was one of our all-time favorite guests. Bishop Spong, or Jack as he liked to be called, died this past summer at the age of 90. We marked his death with a really short recording, part of an interview he'd done with Tapestry a few years back. And then, over the next few days, we heard from so many listeners wondering, who was that? So today, a longer conversation recorded over 2 Tapestry episodes in 2007 and 2009. John Shelby Spong was that very rare soul, a bishop who questioned everything, a man who had a profound connection with Christianity while dismissing all the stories about miracles and virgin birth, a human being who believed in a kind of life after death, but not in the kind of heaven he was taught to believe in when he was a child.
What makes me confident in life after death, but what makes me confident that I am not just mortal?
By the way, I bought his book. I bought a couple books from him, but the only book of the 2 that I finished was called Eternal Life, and his case for the history of heaven and hell, the concept of it, and also why he thinks there is eternal life. And yeah, it was an interesting read, but I feel like more than his books, his talking is better. Just like I feel with the likes of some other speakers, like Christopher Hitchens, or Jordan Peterson. I feel like they're better speakers than they are. Like their writing, I just don't like as much as their talking. Their talking is way better. So let's listen to what he has to say. I've listened to this already, like in university days, but this will be nice to hear it again.
Is that I am in a relationship with, I believe, that which is eternal. And so I will be held inside God's eternity. It's not that I've got a soul inside me that's shaped like a kidney or something or other that's going to go on living. It's that the relationship between my life and the source of life is at one. And so the source of life I become a part of.
Remembering John Shelby Spong, today on Tapestry. I'm Mary Hines. He was, quite simply, one of the most powerful speakers we've ever met here at Tapestry. When John Shelby Spong was the Bishop of Newark, New Jersey, he ordained the first openly gay priest in the Episcopal Church. Bishop Spong wrote more than 25 books, including the bestsellers Why Christianity Must Change or Die and The Sins of Scripture. John Shelby Spong died this past summer at the age of 90. I had the pleasure of interviewing him a couple of times. Here's what it sounded like when Spong brought his lively mind and his very big heart to Tapestry. We've had a sneak preview of this conversation, I think, because you hinted the last time you were here that your final book was going to be about a man near the end of his life, or at least with more years behind him than ahead of him, turning his thoughts to what comes next. And I'm wondering if you can take me through your state of mind. If you can tell me a little bit about your state of mind as you wrote this book.
Well, it was hard. That's the hardest book I think I've ever tried to write. And the reason is not any of the obvious things. The reason is that language itself is a creature of time and space. And I'm trying to describe an experience that's not bounded by time or space. But I became deeply convinced, and I still am, that if you sink life deep enough, that you touch the realm of the eternal. Like what we've done religiously over the centuries is to take the telescope that we've looked for God, and we've looked out into space, we've looked above the sky, beyond the stars. And the day has come, I think, when you've got to turn that telescope inward and look for God within life, within human life. And that's what I've tried to do in this book, and that's where I think I find the footprints of eternity.
But you posed the question at one point, would a man have to be insane to start walking down this road? It must have been daunting.
It was. I first started this book 25 years ago,
Yes.
and then I quit it, and then I started it again. It wasn't until I did two things. One is I began to think that the way into this subject is not through religion, but through life and the life sciences particularly. And the other was when I began to have the courage to trust my own intuitions and to write it as a kind of spiritual autobiography of somebody who is walking, I hope with integrity, into the questions of life and its meaning, and life after death and its meaning. I don't need life after death, Mary, and I think that needs to be said. If I died tomorrow, I'd die a happy camper. I've had an incredible, wonderful life, and I don't feel I've got anything lacking or that I've got to have something coming. This life by itself is quite enough for me. But the older I get, the more deeply I live, the more I think I touch what I can call the footprints of the transcendent, or the hints of eternity. And I believe that we ought to explore those, because that's a part of what life is all about. I am fascinated with what it means to be alive.
This book is all about living and dying, and what might come after the dying part. Your publisher had something to say about the title and why it must not mention the word death, even though it's an exploration into what might come after life. Tell me about that conversation.
I think my publisher was wrong, and we had a really emotional battle where I said, I'm not sure I want you to publish this book. And they said, we're not going to publish it with the word death in it. Their idea was that people are in denial about death, and I think my publisher was too. But death is a part of life. I think it's a natural part of life.
You don't hear that very often, that someone has lived a fulfilled life. Yeah, this guy, it's great to hear that this life was enough for him at the end of his life, and that he doesn't desire anything more, even regardless of what happens after he dies. So, yeah, that's great to hear indeed.
I will die. That's a very natural part of being who I am.
But were you this sanguine about it as a young man of 22?
Sanguine? No, I don't think so. I've tasted death in a lot of ways. As a very young kid, I lost my father at age 12. I fortunately had my mother well into my adulthood. She died at 92. But I know what it means to bury a wife that you love very deeply. I have walked with people in death experiences that have been deeply enriching to me. I dedicated the book to 9 people whose deaths had been life-giving sources of new understanding for me, and they ranged from a 2-year-old child to an 84-year-old woman who lived so deeply and richly, and she lived every minute, and that's what I want to do. I want to scale the heights of every minute. I want to wring the sweetness out of every moment of life, and that's how you prepare for life, which is eternal, I think, not by drawing back and saying, oh, this life is nothing, the next life is everything. I think that's absolutely wrong. I think this life opens into everything.
I think you've come to a point, though, that not many of us have reached when it comes to a mature looking at death and saying, you say in the book, I'm right there with St. Francis. I can view death as my brother. I'm fine, and I don't need life after death. I'm intrigued by something you explore at some length in the book, and this is the idea that all through history, the thought of dying has been so unbearable to human beings that we had to invent religion, and we had to, in your view, invent a certain kind of God just to be able to cope
with death.
Can you tell me about the terror that you feel spawned religion?
Yes, I think that human beings are the only creature in all of the universe that we know about who knows that he or she is going to die. Dogs and cats might get anxious when the predator pounces, but they don't go through life anticipating it. And I tell people, I don't know of any sheep that buy life insurance or any dog that makes out a last will and testament. But human beings live their lives under the shadow of death. And I can understand the need for narcotics, and I mean by that not just drugs, but the narcotic of religion or the pleasure principle of whatever it takes, the quest for money, whatever it takes to sort of still the anxieties in people's hearts. I can understand that, but I think it's all a kind of false thing, because I think what you've got to do is to accept the fact that life is mortal, accept the fact that you are an anxiety-filled creature. That's part of what it means to be human. Accept the fact that you don't have peace of mind and learn to live with integrity. If religion would confirm us in the worthwhile quality of life, instead of trying to give us peace of mind or give us security or give us a narcotic. I was interviewed recently by a religious person who in effect said, you've got to give people assurance whether you believe it or not. Well, I don't think that's true. I think that's very revealing. I don't believe a religion that's foisted upon people because you think they need it is ever going to be successful.
I'd like to stay with this point for a minute, because it's there's something very poignant in the way you write about it. Just the courage that it takes to be a human being. You're suggesting that the anxiety we feel, largely because of death, is no small thing. You know, that just being human takes enormous courage. And in your words in the book, self-consciousness and self-awareness and the awareness of our death moves our emotional lives into this eternal state of perpetual overload. Yeah. So what are you seeing there now? What's so hard about being human in that context?
Well, human beings have to raise the question of whether life has any meaning. Dogs and cats and sheep don't raise that question. They just sort of are sheep. You know, the sheep, the moment the sheep is born, fortunately has a neck long enough to reach the ground, and so they start grazing, and that's basically what they do. And so life in the animal kingdom is that you're born, and you don't know you're born. You're alive, but you don't really know you're alive. And you eat, and you grow, and you mate, and you reproduce, and you die, but you don't know how you're doing any of these things. That's just the routine. So you don't raise the question about whether it has any purpose to be a sheep. And you don't raise the question about whether being a sheep has any meaning, but human beings do. And I think the greatest evolutionary step was not when life came out of material things, or even when consciousness came out of life, but the moment when self-consciousness emerged out of consciousness, and nobody knows why that happened. It's sort of an interesting thing to follow, and I think we're still evolving. In fact, what I think I see is that beyond self-consciousness, there is a universal consciousness, and that what we are in the process of doing is that religion is an activity that is necessary in the self-conscious stage, but once we pass into a universal consciousness, we know that we're not separate, that we are not alone, that we're part of something great, big, and bigger than we are. And you find hints of that even in the biblical story where Jesus says the kingdom of God is within you, and that's where I think we ought to be looking.
You have given a lot of thought.
He's tapping into not just Christianity, but what a lot of other religions tap into, whether it's Buddhism or Hinduism, this idea of universal consciousness. I know it's more prevalent in Buddhism. I think Hinduism, there's a bit of like Maya is the dream world that we're living in. I'm not sure how much the oneness is part of Hinduism, to be honest, but I know in Buddhism this oneness, this universal consciousness is quite prevalent in I could be wrong, but from what I've gathered, that seems to be the case. Anyways, he's tapping not into just Christianity, but what is common across other religions too, this universal consciousness. And that's one of the things that drew me to him when I was listening to him in university days. And at the first time, that was an introduction into this idea of oneness and separateness is an illusion. All of that, I was just starting to hear that for the first time. I think he was one of the first people who I learned this through. Anyway, so
The random nature of life, to how accidental it is. The fact that you even exist. You know, one egg, one sperm, John Spong, voila.
Yep.
Why is the accidental quality of life important in a discussion of eternal life? Why have you delved into this so
I think it's
thoroughly?
important because I've got to get us away from the idea that everything is planned and directed by a supernatural God above the sky. You know,
this is probably a scam. Hello? That was definitely a telemarketer. I'm gonna block. Stupid. Block. How do you block? How do you block? Block. Report spam. Sorry about that interruption. Let's continue.
there was a single cell from my father that invaded a single egg cell from my mother, presumably in the middle of the night, that determined my sex, my gender, my torso shape, my...
I came across a vid this week that sort of made reference to God actually existing, but we can't comprehend it fully. It was fascinating and a bit shocking. If you can find that video and send it to me again, if you can find that video again and send it to me, whether in my Discord server or in this chat, I'll check it out. I'm always fascinated by this topic, so I don't even answer ransom numbers when they call unless they leave a message to call them back and I recognize their voice. I will post the video time in your Discord. Cool. Thanks, Doomer. Yeah, random numbers. I answer it just in case, because sometimes a number I don't know is actually an important phone call that I needed to get, so I answer it just in case, yeah.
my intelligence, and even how long I would live. Now, I can bend that ladder one a little bit by good health practices, but there's a biological clock in every one of us that's ticking, and it ticks from the moment of conception. And it puts the absolute limit upon our humanity. We read in the paper where somebody died who was 112. Well, that's right remarkable, but he or she owes that to genetics, not to much else. And I love to hear them give explanations. And one says it's because I drink whiskey all my life.
They always drink whiskey.
Yeah,
Have you
it's
noticed
just really remarkable. But not only is every individual an accidental thing, but human life itself is accidental. And I go back in my studies to that event, which took place about 65 million years ago, when a comet of rather enormous size appears to have collided with the planet Earth and have thrown the planet Earth off its orbit and changed its temperature, its climate, and reordered the life forms on this world. That's when the dinosaurs went out of existence.
You play with the idea of getting us into life after death again, and what possibly comes next. You toy with the idea of eternal rest, that it might have been tremendously appealing when people did physical labor in the fields all day long, every day of the week. Today, that, in your words, this sounds more like a promise of playing shuffleboard in some retirement community for the next 500,000 years. Please spare me. You know, as an incentive, it doesn't work anymore. So you're not into the eternal rest idea yourself?
The thing about it is that every symbol we've had for heaven, whether it's the land flowing with milk and honey, which really comes out of the Jews' migration in the wilderness, or a place where there's no sorrow, sadness, or separation, which comes out of the early years of Christian persecution, or eternal rest, which comes out of the serf's life in the Middle Ages, where they worked at backbreaking toil from sunup to sundown and only had the Sabbath off. And so, you know, we still have some of that. We have restaurants called Thank God It's Friday, because then you're able to get away from work. But I think that what we need to recognize from that is that none of those symbols ought to be literalized. I'd hate to live on milk and bread and, milk and honey. We don't literalize those. We look for what is there that we can say in the 21st century brings fulfillment to life, and that's what we're trying to communicate. And again, that's to try to separate the experience from the explanation. There is no explanation that is ever eternal. The moment I explain anything, I capture it in my time, and my time will not last. It won't last 10 years, 20 years, 50 years.
Is this an ad?
You are listening to Tapestry on CBC Radio 1, on Sirius XM satellite radio, on podcast, on the CBC Listen app, and online at cbc.ca. On today's episode, the best of Bishop John Shelby Spong from earlier interviews on Tapestry.
Wow, that is loud.
I want people to know what comes next in this book, which is you saying, I recoil even now to write these words.
Yeah.
Was it difficult for you to put pen to paper and do what amounts to a reverse creed? I no longer believe in any of this, says the bishop.
Not difficult in the sense that I think I can only do this when I've come to a new and deeper understanding of who God is and what God is and how I relate to God. That gives me the courage to lay down the inadequate definitions of yesterday. And I think that's probably the thing that the Christian church has got to understand. I think the Christian church basically doesn't believe in God anymore, but they believe in believing in God. And so they keep trying to artificially respirate concepts that are simply not conceivable to people that live in my era. So it was not difficult from that point of view. I have maybe a messianic quality about me. I really believe that the Christian church has the power to reform itself and to continue to live. And I dedicate an enormous amount of energy to trying to assist that process. I hope to die a Christian, and I like to use that word. I like to claim that because I don't want Benedict XVI and Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson defining what the word Christian means. I don't mean to say that they aren't within the boundaries of that definition, but I don't think that's the only definition. I think that there is a better way to understand Christianity than the ones that are in the popular religious voices. And so when I come to that understanding, it's easy for me to lay it down. But there is a certain shock value in that because, I can remember as a little boy, especially as I was trying to make sense out of my father's death, that I did all sorts of bargains with the God above the sky. God, if you do this for me, I'll do this for you. And I'm not sure I would have gotten through that period of my life if I had not been sort of a fundamentalist Christian. I think it gave me the security. The trouble is, if I had continued to live in that, I would have stopped growing. I would have died as a person or as a spirit.
That's a very moving part of the story you tell in the book. This is your dad dies. You know, on the one hand, what the criteria are for going to heaven, and your dad, loved though he was, met none of them.
That's correct.
He drank and gambled and
Yep. He didn't like church either. We were raised in evangelical Anglican church. And they're just as evangelical as anybody else when you get to that fringe. And so we had all the answers, and it was it's a behavior control religion. And so they tell you that the greatest virtue is to go to church every Sunday, which of course helps the institution. And the sins of the flesh are the ones that they extol negatively, drinking, gambling, smoking. Well, my father was an episodic alcoholic. He loved to go to the Elks Club and play slot machines. He gambled at bridge with his friends. He cussed like a sailor. He did all the things that my church taught me were the first-class ticket into hell. And then when he died, all the comforters from that church came to tell me what a wonderful man he was and how he was very happy now that he was with God in heaven and that I should rejoice too. And one even told me that God needed my father. Well, that didn't make any sense to me. Why is God so needy? Does God need the breadwinner for a family of 5? And my mother was not an educated woman. She didn't finish the 9th grade in school. She was functionally illiterate. And we were cast into abject poverty at that point in our lives. And for people to tell me this was good news was just nonsensical. The thing that saved me was that about 4 months before my father died, I became, through the action of my aunt, a member of a boys' choir in another Episcopal church or Anglican church in downtown Charlotte. And it was so different. It was in a different tradition. It was much more mysterious. Indeed, I experienced church as worship. But I went from that finally into what I am in now. I believe God is real, and I believe that the Christian life is a journey into the reality of God. And I don't believe there's a roadmap, and I don't believe there are boundaries. I think the job of the Christian church is to transform the world so that everybody in that world has a better chance to live and to love and to be. And the more deep you live and love and be, the more I think you experience what I think is the reality of God.
You acknowledge, though, that you
Has a better chance to live and to love and to be. And the more deep you live and love and be, the more I think you experience what I think is the reality of God.
The more you deeply live and love and be, the more you are something in the reality of God, living in the reality of God. Yeah, that is a beautiful. You just have to live and love and be, and that is.
I think the job of the Christian church is to transform the world so that everybody in that world has a better chance to live and to love and to be. And the more deep you live and love and be, the more I think you experience what I think is the reality of God.
The more you experience the reality of God. That's beautiful. It's not about dogma and you have to believe this and that. It's just live and love and be more deeply and experience. That is experiencing the reality of God.
You acknowledge, though, that you are moving into a realm beyond words.
Yes.
What you're talking about does not lend itself
That's correct.
very freely to a nuts and bolts description. How do you bring people along on that journey? You can't wrap it up and tie it up with a bow. You can't say,
true.
Here's what I believe. How about it?
It demands an awful lot of human maturity, and the church really doesn't like maturity. And that's why the Christian church always wants you to be born again, so to be a child all over again. If you get born again enough times, you never have to grow up. Yeah, I think it takes an enormous amount of maturity to be Christian. I think it takes an enormous amount of maturity just to be human and to discover the spiritual realm of life, which I think that realm is real. Now, how do you do it institutionally? I don't know. But the church is dying, Mary. There's a spiritual hunger in the hearts of most people, but they're turned off by institutional religion.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean they don't want to be on a spiritual journey. So we have lots of things encouraging a spiritual journey, and I think Christianity will someday move into that and finally claim that, but we'll probably get a lot worse off before that happens.
Do you worry about the comfort side of this being tossed away? If the comfort part of the equation has been so important to the human psyche over the years, if what you're offering and if what you've found is so divorced from that kind of comfort, and if that comfort is something that's so central to a human being's needs, is that a fundamental problem?
Well, it is, but I think that what we're talking about again is maturity, human maturity. I don't want to remain a child. I loved being a child. I had a good childhood. But I don't want to be a child all my life, and I don't want to pretend that my parents have simply moved into the sky, but nothing's changed. God is still handing out reward and punishment, just like my mother did. If you're a good boy, you got a reward. If you're a bad boy, you got punished. To me, that never creates maturity.
You've acknowledged that this part of this conversation takes place in the realm beyond words, yet you found words for the way you wrap up your thoughts in this book, that this life is not all there is, to your way of thinking. This life is not the end of life. And I want to know why you think that's true. You've discarded so much of what used to be bedrock in terms of your belief. Why does this remain, this conviction
I think because
that this is not all there is?
Yeah, I think it's because the deeper I go into life, the more I find something that's beyond our boundaries. And I kept pressing this. I find it in biology when I discover that life is all united. DNA relates us to plankton and to cabbages and to great apes alike. It's as if life is one unfolding whole and we're just the self-conscious part of it, but it's so much bigger than we are, but we're the only ones that can appreciate it. I find it in Carl Jung's description of what he calls the collective unconscious that seems to relate us to many things before and many things that will come after.
Yeah, the collective unconscious, that concept by Carl Jung is, I think, consistent with all the other uh, like universal consciousness kind of concepts of other religions. Um, I tried reading a couple of Carl Jung's books. They were too difficult to get through, and it was just so boring. Um, what I realized is it's better to listen to summaries and snippets about what Carl Jung's teachings are instead of reading Carl Jung's books themselves, because I failed at that. I tried it and I failed at it. I just didn't finish the two books that I bought of his that were highly recommended. They were recommended by Jordan Peterson, so I picked them up. Did not get through them.
I find it in almost every place I look, and I find the drive to survival, for survival in every living thing. It becomes self-conscious in human life, but I don't think that's the end. I think the end of human life is to transcend the level of survival and be able to give your life away. Now, how do you do that? The one place where I think people can experience that is in the very human experience of falling in love. When you fall in love, and I can speak with that because I am still in love, when you're in love with somebody, you suddenly love them more than you love yourself. That's very different human experience. And you desire the well-being of the beloved more than the well-being of yourself. And you will put your life on the line for the life of the one that you love the most. And that's a taste, I think, of immortality. That gets us beyond the boundaries of survival.
You've said you don't want to walk away from religion as much as you want to walk through it.
Yes.
And then beyond it.
Yes.
Are you beyond it now?
It's hard to say. I still go to church every Sunday, and I love my church. I'm someone who wrestles with this church because I love this church. And I want this church to open to what I think the spiritual realities of our faith tradition are, and not to be caught in the literalizations that have deeply hurt people.
Does it seem to you as though you have tossed out every traditional understanding of God,
No.
but retained, it was a two-part question, Bishop.
Okay.
Hang on, you're too fast for me. That you've tossed out a lot of the traditional views of God, but kept many traditional views of Jesus?
I think what I've tossed out are human attempts to explain the inexplicable. And that really needs to be tossed out. I say to people, I cannot tell you who God is or what God is. I can only tell you how I believe I experienced the holy, and I might be deluded. And I don't know why that isn't understood. Can a horse tell you what it means to be human? How can a horse get beyond the boundaries of being a horse and say what it means to be human? Why do we think a human being can say what it means to be God? And yet we've done that, and we said we've got it so right that if you don't believe it, we'll burn you at the stake. That's a very strange idea. No, I think I've tossed out some of the idolatry. But I'm a God-intoxicated human being, Mary. I can't step out of that to save my life. I believe that I walk in this world in touch with something that is far greater than I will ever understand. And I'm content to let the mystery be there.
You are listening to Tapestry on CBC Radio 1, on Sirius XM Satellite Radio, on podcast, on the CBC Listen app, and online at cbc.ca. On today's episode, the best of Bishop John Shelby Spong from earlier interviews on Tapestry. If you strip away the miracles, who do you see as Jesus the man? Jesus the Jew?
Yeah, Jesus very much a Jew. Well, it's hard to do because, again, we need to recognize that Jesus, according to the best estimates that we can put together, probably lived between 4 BCE and 30 CE. The first gospel is not written before 70, so we've got 40 years. The last gospel is written about 100, so we've got 70 years. The range is 40 to 70 years. So everything we know about Jesus was interpreted or...
It seems
hear
to
that
you as
part.
though you have tossed out views of God, but kept
God is.
of Jesus.
Let's hear that part again.
I think what I've tossed out are human attempts to explain the inexplicable. And that really needs to be tossed out. I say to people, I cannot tell you who God is or what God is. I can only tell you how I believe I experienced the holy, and I might be deluded. And I don't know why that isn't understood. Can a horse tell you what it means to be human? How can a horse get beyond the boundaries of being a horse and say what it means to be human? Why do we think a human being can say what it means to be God? And yet we've done that, and we said we've got it so right that if you don't believe it, we'll burn you at the stake. That's a very strange idea. No, I think I've tossed out some of the idolatry. But I'm a God-intoxicated human being, Mary. I can't step out of that to save my life. I believe that I walk in this world in touch with something that is far greater than I will ever understand. And I'm content to let the mystery be there. Our great
Up and online. The miracles. Who do you see as Jesus the man? Jesus the Jew?
Yeah, Jesus very much a Jew. Well, it's hard to do because, again, we need to recognize that Jesus, according to the best estimates that we can put together, probably lived between 4 BCE and 30 CE. The first gospel is not written before 70, so we've got 40 years. The last gospel is written about 100, so we've got 70 years. The range is 40 to 70 years. So everything we know about Jesus was interpreted orally for 40 to 70 years before it was written down. That ought to lead us to some understanding that this is not to be taken literally. It's an interpretive process. And it was in a Jewish world, so they used the interpretive images available to a Jewish world. So he was the new Moses, he was the new Elijah, he was the suffering servant from 2nd Isaiah, he was the shepherd king from Zechariah, he was the Son of Man from Ezekiel and Daniel. He's the inaugurator of the kingdom of God. He's the heir to the throne of David. That gives us the Bethlehem story. He's the founder of the new Israel, and that gives us the 12 disciples. Those are all interpretive processes. And the first thing that people need to understand is that they're first century Jewish interpretations. If Jesus had come to Toronto, my guess is that the experience you had would be quite similar to the experience that first century Jews had. But when Torontons, is that the right way you say for
Torontonians.
Torontonians, I didn't think that sounded right.
Toronto folks.
When Torontonians would write about that experience, they wouldn't call Jesus the new Passover, because that's not. And the first thing that people need to understand is that they're first century Jewish interpretations. If Jesus had come to Toronto, my guess is that the experience you had would be quite similar to the experience that first century Jews had. But when Torontons, is that the right way you say for
Torontonians.
Torontonians, I didn't think
What do you say?
To Toronto. My guess is that the experience you had would be quite similar to the experience that first century Jews had. But when Torontons, is that the right way you say for
Torontonians.
Torontonians, I didn't think that sounded right.
Toronto folks.
When Torontonians would write about that experience, they wouldn't call Jesus the new Passover, because that's not part of Toronto's culture. They wouldn't call him the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, because that's out of the Jewish Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. They wouldn't call him the light restored to the temple, because that's a Jewish image that wouldn't make any sense today. So all of the images that we've used in the New Testament are products of their time, and our job is not to literalize those images, but to understand what lies behind them. And what lies behind them, in my opinion, is a human life that is so full and so free and so open that they experience the divine, whatever that means, flowing through him. And you see it in very dramatic fashion. You see him as not being bound by tribal identity, which is the bane of the world's existence today. A tribal identity allows you to hate all your enemies. But Jesus doesn't seem to be bound by the division between Jew and Gentile. Indeed, the whole gospel message says you've got to go into all the world. That's where Gentiles live. That's where people that are different from you live. And you've got to proclaim the gospel.
Wow, he was so in tune with his faith and religion, but he's saying that you can't say it literally. Wish all people knew that. Yeah.
That doesn't mean you've got to convert them to Christianity. You've got to proclaim that they too are part of God's creation. They too share in the love of God. That's what the gospel is all about. It's good news.
Let's hear that again.
Today, a tribal identity allows you to hate all your enemies. But Jesus doesn't seem to be bound by the division between Jew and Gentile. Indeed, the whole gospel message says you've got to go into all the world. That's where Gentiles live. That's where people that are different from you live. And you've got to proclaim the gospel. That doesn't mean you've got to convert them to Christianity. You've got to proclaim that they too are part of God's creation. They too share in the love of God. That's what the gospel is all about. It's good news. So that becomes the way you tell the story. And Jesus walks across that boundary, and his humanity grows because tribal boundaries limit your humanity. And he grows beyond prejudice boundaries. Jesus lived in a world where the Jew and the Samaritan were deeply divided by prejudice. And Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, and he recognizes that if I'm busy looking down on you, my humanity is impaired as well as yours. So I can't be fully human and look down upon people of color or women or homosexuals or other religions or whatever the victim of our prejudice is. The boundary between men and women, it's been such a perilous boundary and over which we fought for so long, with men trying to claim that they were created in the image of God and women were sort of second-class citizens. That's an impossibility inside the Jesus experience. And that's why you see him having female disciples, which the church has tried to suppress, but you can't get rid of them. They're in the book. And talking to the woman by the well and doing all the things that he does to enhance the full humanity of women. And the thing that's most powerful to me is that Jesus also challenges religion. He steps beyond the boundaries of his religious system. And one of the great quotations attributed to him is that human beings were not made to fit into the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made to enrich the life of human beings.
How do you understand that passage?
Well, I understand that to mean that no religious rule is a valid religious rule unless it enhances human life. And so long as we create religious rules that diminish human life, which is what most of them do, then we don't understand what it is we're talking about.
If you're right, Bishop Spong, if the way you read the Bible is right, that means Christianity has been, perverted over the past 2,000 years?
Yes, I think that's a serious charge, but I believe that's accurate. And I think the reason for that is that the Gospels, especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the first three, are so deeply shaped by a Jewish world, by a Jewish mentality, by a Jewish vocabulary.
Matthew, Mark, and Luke?
Bishop Spong, if the way you read the Bible is right, that means Christianity has been, perverted over the past 2,000 years?
Yes, I think that's a serious charge, but I believe that's accurate. And I think the reason for that is that the Gospels, especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the first three, are so deeply shaped by a Jewish world, by a Jewish mentality, by a Jewish vocabulary, and even by Jewish history. The images are deeply Jewish. You can't read one chapter without finding yourself drawn into all sorts of things that if you don't know what the background is, you're not going to understand it. But by about the year 125 of this Common Era, Christianity had become almost a totally Gentile movement. From about 125 until the latter years of the 20th century, the only people that read the Gospels, wrote commentaries on the Gospels, taught the Gospels, were Gentile people who were abysmally ignorant of the Jewish background of those stories. And what I'm trying to do is get us over that. Life does move on, and if we can just go back now and understand the symbols, you don't literalize the symbols. You understand the symbols, and you walk through the symbols to help you try to articulate what the experience was, and then you look for 21st century words to talk about that experience, knowing that by the 22nd or 23rd century, you've got to do it all over again, because words and concepts are always shifting and changing.
So what would be the words of our era? What would be words more appropriate to this time, this place?
Let me answer that by saying that the reason I entitled this book Jesus for the Non-Religious is that I think religion as such has become bankrupt. And I think you've got to lift the Jesus experience out of the boundaries of religion. And the person who helped me see that is a German Lutheran theologian named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was killed by the Nazis, hanged by the Nazis in 1945. And the only thing we've got that Bonhoeffer wrote, besides some early stuff, is the letters in the papers from prison that he wrote to his good friend Eberhard Bethge. And they've been preserved. And in those letters, he talks about breaking Christianity out of the boundaries of religion. He goes so far as to say that Christianity could not finally be contained within Judaism because it was a force that was driving toward universality, and so it had to escape the boundaries of Judaism. And in our day, he said, and he's writing this about 1943 or 1944, we've reached the place where Christianity cannot be included within the boundaries of religion, so it's got to escape.
There's a beautiful idea that the Hebrew name for God, what was it? Jehovah? It was something like Jehovah. Needs no pronunciation. You simply need to inhale and exhale. So the first word you ever utter in this life is a person in the name of God. Daywalker, hi Paul, sorry for your loss. Oh, I'm not too sad that he's gone. It's just a great way to remember him by actually revisiting some of the stuff that he's saying. I haven't listened to him in so long, so his death actually brought about a very good peace. And let me just, I want to download this book, Jesus for the Non-Religious. PDF, yeah. Okay, I'll download it later. Let's continue listening.
He talks about breaking Christianity out of the boundaries of religion. He goes so far as to say that Christianity could not finally be contained within Judaism, because Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the 3rd century, you've got to do it all over again because words and concepts are always shifting and changing.
So what would be the words of our era? What would be words more appropriate to this time, this place?
Let me answer that by saying that the reason I entitled this book Jesus for the Non-Religious is that I think religion as such has become bankrupt. And I think you've got to lift the Jesus experience out of the boundaries of religion. And the person who helped me see that is a German Lutheran theologian named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was killed by the Nazis, hanged by the Nazis in 1945. And the only thing we've got that Bonhoeffer wrote, besides some early stuff, is the letters in the papers from prison that he wrote to his good friend Eberhard Bethge.
Oh, I didn't realize it was you who said it, Lauren. The Jehovah, Yahweh, I think it's Jehovah. Jehovah, I think that's YHWH. Jehovah. I forget. My Jewish friend told me how to pronounce it, and yet I forgot. It was something similar to Jehovah.
And they've been preserved. And in those letters, he talks about breaking Christianity out of the boundaries of religion. He goes so far as to say that Christianity could not finally be contained within Judaism because it was a force that was driving toward universality, and so it had to escape the boundaries of Judaism. And in our day, he said, and he's writing this about 1943 or 1944, we've reached the place where Christianity cannot be included within the boundaries of religion, so it's got to escape religion. And when it does, many aspects of religion are going to fall away and die, but I don't think the Christ experience will. And then we'll have the task of finding new words and new concepts to try to make sense out of that experience. When I talk about God and Jesus in a public way, I start out by saying I can't tell you who God is or what God is. I can only tell you how I believe I experience God. And when I talk that way, I experience God as the power of life that flows through the universe. I experience God as the power of love that constantly enhances life. I experience God, in the words of my theological teacher, Paul Tillich, as the ground of all being. And that means that the job of the Christian church is to help people to live fully and to love wastefully and to be all that they can be. That's a very different agenda from the agenda I see going on in the life of the church today, where we want to make people religious and make them church members.
I've heard him say
I'm Mary
that.
Hines. This is Tapestry.
I've heard him say that many times. Live fully and love wastefully. Let's hear that again.
God is. I can only tell you how I believe I experience God. And when I talk that way, I experience God as the power of life that flows through the universe. I experience God as the power of love that constantly enhances life. I experience God, in the words of my theological teacher, Paul Tillich, as the ground of all being. And that means that the job of the Christian church is to help people to live fully and to love wastefully and to be all that they can be. That's a very different agenda from the agenda I see going on in the life.
To live fully and to love wastefully and to be all that you can be. Yeah, that's beautiful.
Of the church today, where we want to make people religious and make them church members.
I'm Mary Hines. This is Tapestry. You're hearing a rebroadcast of conversations with Bishop John Shelby Spong, who died last summer at the age of 90. If you are telling the story of Jesus to someone who does not have to break out of any old concepts, starting from scratch, it's a bedtime story with your grandson.
See, I think the basic meaning of Jesus is that you are loved just as you are, no matter who you are, no matter what you've done. And the thing that attracts me to this Jesus over and over again is that his humanity is such that no matter what people do to him, he responds, he transforms it by responding with love. They betray him and he loves them. They deny him and he loves them. They forsake him and he loves them. They abandon him and he loves them. They kill him and he loves them. I don't know how else you can act out the idea that there's nothing you can do or nothing you can be that will ever separate you from the love of God. That's what the cross is all about. The cross is not where Jesus died for your sins, where God punished Jesus instead of you because you couldn't take it. It's a place where you see one whose humanity is so complete that he doesn't have to grasp after his survival. He can give his life away. He can lay it down. I would die for my wife without thinking about it, because I love her more than I love me. That's a new level of consciousness. That's a new level of humanity. I don't know that I could do it for many people other than my wife, because if I'm honest, there's nobody I love more than I love me out there in the world. Maybe my children, maybe my grandchildren, but that's not a great number. But in the Jesus story, we're told that the love of God is so perfectly lived out in him that he is able to give his life away, not just for the most beloved in his life, but for the least of these, his brothers and sisters. So he spent his life with the prostitutes and with the lepers and with the outcast of society. So that when I look at my church today that debates whether or not it's going to close its doors to certain people that our society calls outcasts, like gay and lesbian people, and in previous generations women, in previous generations people of color, to me that's a debate about the essence of Christianity itself. If anybody is not welcomed inside the love of God, then the love of God has been so prostituted that I don't want to be a part of it. And that's the issue. And the Christian church is busy trying to survive.
But what do you see happening from this point on in the churches? Do you think does Christianity have to collapse for something new to be born in its place?
Well, as I look at history, you never start a new religion. You always evolve out of what you've had. And I think that we're in a period of evolving today. That doesn't always happen. But what happens is that events will come together so that the old patterns don't make sense anymore. And then there's a debate between a new inbreaking consciousness and the old verities. And that's where we are today. But eventually the new inbreaking consciousness always wins. You never debate a prejudice publicly until it's dying. It's not going to die until a new definition challenges the old definition. The old definition was that homosexual people were either mentally sick or morally depraved. If you go back 100 years, the definition of a woman was that she was an emotional disaster and she couldn't possibly function in the business world of men, couldn't be educated in public universities because they didn't even have brains enough, couldn't vote because they might choose the wrong president. Well, I'd like to suggest that the men have more than once elected the wrong president in the United States. And so those are definitions. The definition of black people was that they were subhuman. That's what enables slavery and segregation. If that definition is challenged, slavery becomes an abhorrent immorality. And so consciousness rose on that, but not with everybody and not in any moment. I've had friends who were so deeply racist that they had to go to their graves bemoaning the fact that black people were now considered equal. But their children adjusted and their grandchildren adjusted. And we have gone as a nation from slavery in 1860 to a viable black candidate to be president of the United States in 2008. That's a very short period of history for that kind of consciousness.
I had an interesting chat with a rabbi last season on the program. And I was explaining that we get so much mail from listeners who say, I consider myself spiritual but not religious, that the feelings I have burst beyond the boundaries of religion. And he said, well, that's just fine. I believe in education, but don't talk to me about schools. I don't want schools. His argument being that you do need the structure, you need the foundation, you need the history. Will that crumble given the picture you're painting?
I don't think it crumbles. I think it evolves. I don't believe that if Christianity had not been institutionalized, I don't think it would have survived. It may not survive because it has been institutionalized. So in some sense, you've always got to have the Catholic ongoing tradition and the Protestant judgment on that tradition at every moment. These have got to always be operating. I think the tragedy with the Christian church is that we let our structures become ossified. We let our words and our creeds, we interpret them as ecclesiastical straitjackets into which we have to fit our bodies and our minds, and they were never meant to be that. The creeds represent an attempt, and they're 4th century documents, the creeds. They're not original. We call one of the creeds the Apostles' Creed, but the apostles never saw those things. And indeed, the virgin birth story, which is in the creeds, didn't develop until well after all the apostles were dead.
Yes.
So that, that's just sort of institutional propaganda. But the creeds developed as the ways people could sing their praises of the God they understood at that moment. And I have no difficulty joining in the singing of my ancestors' song. But I don't treat those as if they're a corset or girdle that I've got to fit my faith into. They're simply part of the past, and I think the job of the Christian faith in every generation is to learn how to sing the Lord's song in the new world that you're in. I see this as a great evolutionary process. I think the church has to constantly be in reformation, and reformations ought not to come as one great cataclysmic outburst against the excesses of the institution, as happened in the 16th century. I think it ought to be an ongoing process, and the church ought to always be open to new ideas and new thoughts, and incorporating those constantly as we walk through history.
You've mentioned an evolving consciousness, and I'm intrigued. Do you see evolution progressing beyond the human being as the human being stands now in 2007? Are we just the latest step in the
I don't see any reason to think that we're the end of the process. The process has been going on for 4.5 billion years, and we are the products at this moment of it, and we're the dominant products at this moment. But the breakthrough for us human beings came maybe 100,000 years ago, when we shifted from consciousness into self-consciousness. That's an enormous shift. And that means that we define ourselves outside of nature. We know we're going to die. We are creatures who, everybody's mortal. Every creature's mortal. Every plant, every insect, every animal is mortal. But they don't know it. We know it. So we have to live with that. And I think that opens us to enormous possibilities. As self-conscious people, we can actually meditate on and commune with what we believe is the source of life. So that's what worship is. I think the definition of humanity is that you're in touch with something beyond yourself, so that we are, by our definition, religious people, if you want to use that word. And to me, that's inevitable, but it also means that you continue to grow. We always thought of God as a being who was separate from the world, who lived somewhere above the sky. Well, that's not a tolerable idea in a post-Copernican, post-Galileo world. What those men did was to destroy God's dwelling place. And then once that was destroyed, then either God doesn't exist or the way you have conceptualized God has to change. And every time there's a new discovery, that's why it's so tragic to watch the church's history of condemning Galileo, condemning Darwin. We ought to rejoice that these people are helping us to understand the process that has produced life and humanity so that we can be part of that. And it's an ongoing process, sure. I don't know what we'll be like in 1,000 years, but I know the things that we'll be talking about and thinking about will be quite different from the way they are today. You know, just 50 years ago, nobody knew what an email was. And that's just an enormous change in our consciousness. So, you know, I have correspondence with friends all over the world today that's instantaneous. I used to write friends of mine in New Zealand, and I could count it. It'd take 9 to 11 days to get the letter there, and if they answered it immediately, it'd take 9 to 11 days to get the answer back. Today, it can happen in 20 minutes. The world is constantly changing, and we've got to constantly adjust. I believe God is real. I believe God permeates life. I believe the secret to Jesus is that somehow his humanity was so whole that God could permeate his life in a way that mine hasn't been permeated, and so he can become the standard. And is that the destiny of humanity? Are we going to all move toward being more Christ-like people? Well, Teilhard de Chardin, a great thinker of the earlier part of the 20th century, certainly proposed that, and of course the church, in his case the Roman Catholic Church, indexed his books and said nobody can read them. He was ahead of his time. But I think that we can look at that and see maybe the future is breaking in upon us.
You refer in your book to all that God means to you now. And you said a moment ago, I believe God is real. Yet you also make the point that you don't believe in a theistic God.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to get you to define God, but I'm confused in the area of God's real but not theistic.
Theism in our language means a belief in God.
Yes.
And so when you say that you believe in God but not a theistic God, that sounds like an oxymoron to people. But what I'm trying to get people to see is that theism is not who God is. Theism is a human definition of God, and that all human definitions can die. And the theistic definition implied a supernatural being who was somewhere external to the world, who periodically invaded the world to produce a miracle. And in many ways, that's the God of the Bible. That's the God who comes in and sends the plagues upon the Egyptians and splits the Red Sea, and is incarnate in the person of Jesus, who can walk on water and do these supernatural things.
The rescuing God, as you referred to,
God,
the divine being.
Now, I think that we need to face that human definition has run its course. The idea that God lives above the sky is a nonsensical idea to people in our world today. The idea that Jesus has to come from the God up there through the virgin birth is a nonsensical idea, primarily because we discover that women have an egg cell in the first quarter of the 18th century, or 19th century. No, it was 18th century, 1724 is the date. And if women have an egg cell, that means that every human being who has ever been born, including Jesus, has received 50% of his or her genetic code from his or her mother. Now, virgin birth stories don't work at that point, because virgin birth stories say that the life of Jesus came from God through the receptacle of the Virgin Mary, who did not add anything to it. But now that we understand that women all have egg cells, that would mean that Jesus was half human and half divine. And that, as I try to make people understand by using a sort of shocking word, that would make Jesus something like a mermaid, half human and half something else. And it doesn't make any sense, and they can grasp that when they see it. But what we've tried to say about Jesus is that in and through his full humanity, we have been introduced to the meaning of that which is beyond humanity, but mediated through humanity. And that's a very different way to understand the Jesus story and the impact of Jesus' life. But I think that's the place we've got to go.
You acknowledge, though, that the idea of death becomes more terrifying than ever once
Yes.
you let go of that theistic God. And in fact, this is the subject of your next book. If death is, as you put it, the ultimate barrier to meaning, how are you regarding death now? Do you see it as the ultimate barrier to meaning?
I see it as getting closer as I get older, and so you have to wrestle with it and deal with it. But you see, what transcends death for me is that I believe that I am related to that which is beyond the boundaries of death, and that's the power of the Jesus story. It's not that he walked out of the grave miraculously reconstituted as a body that breathes and eats and walks and talks and interprets the Bible as it's portrayed, because that's the only language people had to try to portray him. I think what we are trying to say in the resurrection is that death cannot finally separate you from God. The earliest resurrection story in Mark's Gospel is the women coming and seeing an empty tomb and being forced to draw some conclusions. And the conclusion is that there's something about this Jesus that transcends the boundaries of death. What makes me confident in life after death, if I can use that word, and that's again a strange word because the word after means it's extended time, and time is a human category, not a divine category, so I don't know how you deal with that. But what makes me confident that I am not just mortal is that I am in a relationship with, I believe, that which is eternal. And so I will be held inside God's eternity. It's not that I've got a soul inside me that's shaped like a kidney or something or other that's going to go on living. It's that the relationship between my life and the source of life is at one. And so the source of life I become a part of. And people want to ask all sorts of other questions out of their anxiety. Will I know my loved ones, for example? Well, I don't know how to answer that. I do know that the person Jack Spong is not a self-made man. I know that my humanity has been created by the lives and the loves of lots of people in my life, most especially my wife. So that if the person I am is created by all of these other relationships, and if this person shares in God's eternity, it seems to me that all my other relationships that created the person that shares in God's eternity have also got to share in God's eternity. But I don't know how you talk about that, Mary. And I think most people that try to talk about life after death in terms of painting the pictures of a land flowing with milk and honey or an eternal
What was
life,
that?
so that if the person I am is created by all of these other relationships, and if this person shares in God's eternity, it seems to me that all my other relationships that created the person that shares in God's eternity have also got to share in God's eternity. But I don't know how you talk about that, Mary. And I think most people that try to talk about life after death in terms of painting the pictures of a land flowing with milk and honey or an eternal Sabbath of rest or whatever the other images are desperately trying to draw a picture of human fulfillment, none of which are important to me. That is, I don't know that I'd be happy with a land flowing with milk and honey. I would hate to have any diet like that. That wonderful picture in the parable of Lazarus and Dives, where Lazarus goes to heaven, and heaven is described as being in the bosom of Abraham. Well, I tell people, if I'm going to be in anybody's bosom through all eternity, I don't want it to be Abraham's. We've got to recognize that those are all images. But what they're trying to say is that it is the unique capacity of human beings to commune with that which is divine. And if the relationship is genuine, we share in that divinity. And beyond that, I don't think you can say anything. So when I write this book, it's going to be a short book.
Bishop John Shelby Spong, what a pleasure it is to talk to you again. Thank you.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you always.
John Shelby Spong was a bishop in the Episcopal Church in the U.S. Bishop Spong wrote more than 25 books, including the bestsellers Why Christianity Must Change or Die and The Sins of Scripture. In his later books, he confronted the idea of his own mortality with more curiosity than fear. Spong died this past summer. He was 90 years old. That's it for us this week. Tapestry is produced by Kent Hoffman and Armand Agbali. The interviews with John Shelby Spong were produced by Susan Mahoney and Marika Mayer. Our digital producer is Sinisha Jolich. The senior producer is Rosie Fernandez. I'm Mary Hines. Thank you for listening.
That was 2021. So he died the summer of 2021. That's 4 years ago already. Yeah, I bought his book, The Eternal Life. I just downloaded his other book that was talked about in the podcast, Jesus for the Non-Religious. I wonder how good that book will be. I wasn't too captivated by the two books that I bought from him, so maybe this talking about Jesus book will be Jesus for the Non-Religious. That might be. I don't know if it'll be good or not, but maybe just like the other speakers and authors, his speaking is more captivating than his writing. Yeah, so that is John Shelby Spong, or Jack Spong. I didn't know he went by Jack. So, yeah, there were some really good points in there. To live life fully, to love wastefully. I think that's experiencing the reality of God. Those kind of points. It's not about teaching people to join your religion. It's about having a full human experience. Yeah, that's a beautiful message. Wait, I'll BRB. Okay. Yeah, so that was John Shelby Spong. I guess that concludes that. This is what he looks like in case you missed it in the first. This is what he looks like. He had a turkey neck. He is very old. Died at age 90, so. Okay, so that's it for John Shelby Spong, or Jack Spong. What do I want to do now? I want to check out this book that I just downloaded, Jesus for the Non-Religious. That is a horrible picture of Jesus. Even if I don't know where that picture came from, but but I don't feel like reading it now. I'll transfer it to my Kindle, but turkey neck, we don't have this term in Turkey, lol. Not even as in turkey. Turkey, turkey. Turkey neck. Gobble gobble. I guess I don't think it was just because of old age. I think he was probably fat at one point. I'm religious, but a Muslim religious, and I love Jesus very much because we Muslims also believe in Jesus, right? Yeah, I think this book could be interesting. Jesus for the Non-Religious. Let's see if it is indeed interesting, because his previous two books were not that interesting. So, well, one was interesting enough for me to finish it, but I don't know how much I got from it. I was pretty young back then when I read that Eternal Life. His Case for Eternal Life, John Spong. I read that post-university, or like mid-university, so maybe between 2010 and 2013, something like that. I think I read that then. Why do Europe and America think Jesus was white? Well, he was a Jew. I mean, it's canon that he has brown tan. And plus, his name was Jeheshua, not Jesus, which is Greek translation. Yeah. Jeheshua, what a Jewish name. It's as Jewish as can get. Oh, Isa, alright. Yeah, I've heard of that. Isa in the Quran. Isa Messi. His Jewish name is Jeheshua. I've heard of that. Joshua? Joshua. Yeah, he was so Jewish that his name almost sounds like Joshua. Wow, that is loud. I guess they're doing... I think I'm going to live stream piano now. Oh, Paul C, we should have stickers for your channel and Discord. Okay, I gotta look into how to do that. I was just thinking about it because you did request it. It was popped into my mind again. I gotta look into how to make that. Okay, let me take requests. What kind of stickers do you want? My face? Stickers, eh? Happy face. I know how to add emojis to Discord. Oh. If you give access to... Oh. Thanks for the stream, Paul. Good topic. Hey, thanks for tuning in, Doomer. Okay, I can message you on Discord then. Give you access. Okay. Yeah. Let's wrap it up. Not just your face, but you know, special stickers for paid subscribers, right? Right. Do I make the special stickers? I made stickers for a 50k plus community. Wow. I need you. Okay. I'll continue this in my Discord chat then. Alright, I'm gonna grab some more water. I'm gonna use the washroom and I'm going to play the piano. Let's do it. Let's play some piano. Alright. I'll see you in the next stream or video. Probably stream. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thanks for tuning in, guys. I appreciate you. In Discord, you basically use PNGs, but I don't know about you.